Stranded within the charred remains of the Pacific Palisades neighborhood in Los Angeles, there is one house that looks like almost nothing happened. Before January 2025, this house sat alongside 100-year-old homes and surrounded by mature trees. It was a little unique, even then, but it wasn't a defining feature of the neighborhood. Then the Palisades fire swept through, decimating over 12,000 buildings and costing $250 billion of destruction in its wake.
Fire began up in the hills above us here and was pushed by extreme winds, creating extremely dangerous and dynamic fire behavior, not only for civilians, but firefighters.
All the while, this house was spared. How is that even possible? The flames arrived from the north and the west just a day after the fire began, roughly a mile up the Santa Monica Mountains. The community is nestled between these mountain ridges, officially making it a wildland urban interface, or a WUI. It was that scenic blend with nature that first drew people here in 1928. That's when this subdivision was originally established. More recently, though, the historic homes and mature trees drew residents with its charm, who paid an incredible premium to live here. Even the most modest homes sold for millions of dollars, like this next-door neighbor. But it's also these natural features that made this area incredibly vulnerable to wildfire. On January 7th, as families rushed to grab pets and photo albums, almost everything about this neighborhood became a hazard. In the most unexpected ways, even. Yes, the emergency water reservoir happened to be offline for repairs, but even the street layout played a role in the rapid spread. The neighborhood's elongated shape, it follows the contours of the ridges of the mountains, and the streets of the grid are then rotated to fit the shape of the terrain. When the 100-mile-per-hour winds whipped down the slopes, they funneled straight through these roadways like tunnels, feeding oxygen to the flames and then letting them leap from house to house. The rotated grid also created a series of bottlenecks for evacuating residents, leaving only a few exits. And when these get all clogged, there's absolutely no way for firefighters to be able to get through. But on this lot, conditions turned out quite differently. The original mission-style 3-bedroom house was replaced only a year ago by this larger 3,400 square foot, 5-bedroom structure that was designed by the architect Greg Chasen for his art professor friend. Many of the design decisions about this house might have seemed a little bit extreme at the outset, yet they proved remarkably prescient when the fire came. But it's important to remember that those choices, they brought serious trade-offs for both the owners and the neighborhood around it. Those trade-offs, they're difficult to quantify or even really fully appreciate until moments like this, when the house successfully weathered the very scenario that it was designed to resist. Let's just compare this new house with the one that stood here before. I know very few people that would look at the replacement and applaud it for the loss of the historic property. It's undeniably less charming. It doesn't quite fit in with the rest of the neighborhood. In the yard, it's not exactly a place where you'd want to barbecue with friends. And that's the price just for one property. Nobody wants to tear down an entire historic district just to rebuild it with safer, higher-performing homes, even though we know we can do it that way. The challenge then, I think, lies in folding in our knowledge into neighborhoods that are still anchored by existing construction. So let's explore exactly what changed between the old house and the new one on this site, and why those measures worked, and what it could mean if more communities adopted the same fire-resistant features. When surrounded by wildfire, this property and its house face several potential threats. The first comes from the danger of flame spread. In the old design, rows of bushes were planted from the property's edge right up to against the house walls. This basically provides like a highway straight to the house for the fire to follow. In the new layout, the architect cleared the way of all vegetation to create what's called a defensible space, where they substituted gravel and a border of board-formed concrete that provides fencing. That way, the flames had nothing to latch onto as they approached the area. Next came the risk of intense heat from the neighbor's house, which can actually ignite surrounding structures even if the flames don't reach over. This is called conflagration. Even though the old home had stucco walls and a clay roof, both of which are pretty good at resisting fire, the house next door had large projecting wooden eaves. And because the two properties sit so close together, conflagration is almost guaranteed if nearby structures have a flammable exterior materials. In response, the design of this house removed all of its eaves and replaced them with a thick, continuous surface that wraps around the entire roofs and sides of the house. It's oriented also to block the winds coming from the north, and it features a metal roof and special underlayment with fire-resistant insulation. This together earned it a Class A flame spread rating, which is about as fireproof as if it was made of concrete. Then there's the issues of how embers fly around and can catch nearby buildings on fire. Research shows that up to 90% of wildfire destruction to homes starts when airborne embers land on or or blow inside of building openings. The old house had a ton of side vents and roof vents and chimneys, all of which are perfect entry points for sparks. Once embers get in, the house burns from the inside out. The new structure, on the other hand, it's almost completely sealed with minimal openings. The airtight envelope didn't just prevent the house from catching fire, it also spared the interior from smoke damage that makes other surviving buildings unlivable without major cleanup. Of course, when you seal a home this tightly, it also conserves energy. Because the thick, flame-resistant walls, they also help maintain interior temperatures and reduce heating and cooling costs. So many of these design decisions that made the building flame-resistant also played multiple other roles in the owner's effort to build responsibly. Even the choice to seal everything has downsides. It's harder to enjoy a typical Southern California lifestyle when the windows aren't designed to just be thrown open. So while this approach was incredibly effective in a wildfire, it also came with trade-offs in lifestyle, not just the cute historic aesthetic loss. Still, that choice ended up being their best line of defense. That kind of thing is why not everyone builds like this. Well, I mean, in some ways they do. For instance, many of the features on this house meet or exceed the section of the California Building Code that regulates new construction for wildfire exposure. It's called Chapter 7A, and it's 6 pages of requirements that any building built since 2008 must comply with. So, while it applied to this house because it was new, it did not apply to its neighbors. However, their non-compliance put this house at risk. So it's not so simple to chalk it up to individual choices alone. Even while this neighborhood is rebuilding, some aspects of its compliance with standards are up to the homeowner. Because after devastating events like this, the assumption is that rebuilding means like-for-like replacement of what was here before, which I think is a little bit crazy. What was here before was the problem. In this instance, current fire code must be followed, but things like zoning or distance from neighbors will be the same. Even so, the mayor here has loosened the review process in order to expedite reconstruction with an emergency order. So no matter what, scrutiny on the rebuilt structures will be less stringent than it would be typically. It's a complex web of interconnected relationships that keep everyone and their homes safe. Regulation and laws are a piece of that puzzle, but only just a piece. California, it's already so regulated that projects to clear brush or create fire breaks between neighborhoods often trigger lengthy reviews under laws like CEQA or the California Environmental Quality Act, and near the coast, the Coastal Act. Governor Newsom himself said that bureaucratic red tape was slowing down critical forest management projects, leading the state in 2025 to temporarily suspend certain regulations to fast-track wildfire prevention efforts. But in reality, neighborhoods, they shouldn't even really be located in WIs at all like this anyway. Efforts to tighten zoning, for example, to limit new construction in very high fire hazard severity zones often face political pushback due to housing needs and property rights. As one urban planning expert observed, wildfire impact is as much a matter of decisions we make about where and how to build as it is about the hazard itself. Yet development in high-risk areas has continued, largely unabated, for decades. The broader issue is that modern cities are not originally designed with wildfire in mind, and retrofitting communities with fire-resistant infrastructure is a massive undertaking that Los Angeles hasn't been fully grappling with.
We're out of time. This is serious now. I don't know how many instances and examples of climate change we need to see to know that we have to make a change now.
Palisades House survived because it was built by someone who was uniquely committed to a cause. They were ready to sacrifice aesthetics and community conformity and even simple pleasures like enjoying windows on a summer day. Yet on all sides, dozens of charming historic homes, rich in local history and community identity, they were wiped away. It is absolutely incredible to me how quickly a problem like this scales up from individual responsibility and decisions up to collective regulation and response. This outcome raises an important question, I think. What is the right approach to balance these pressures between cost, charm, and security, and individual efforts and collective ones? When should communities rebuild radically differently? Or is the cost to our lifestyle and identity just simply too great? If you imagine a neighborhood where each house resembles that lone survivor, it would be unquestionably safer. But would we still feel at home here? Neighborhoods elsewhere have already faced these kinds of decisions. Ventura County's fire-safe guidelines subtly incorporate wider streets, strategic landscaping, and smarter materials. And these guidelines create neighborhoods that look traditional, yet they're highly resistant. Similarly, after devastating wildfires in Australia in 2019, towns grappled with blending fire safety into its historic fabric. Residents found creative ways to retain local character while significantly enhancing safety overall. So it's possible to blend all this together, the tradition and the innovation effectively. But it's not just about how we build individual houses either. Effective wildfire resilience also demands broader changes in infrastructure, power lines buried underground, strategic water reserves placed nearby, and roads designed to facilitate both evacuation and firefighting. These seemingly mundane adjustments, they can mean the difference between survival and total loss, but they often struggle to gain community support because their impact is not immediately visible. I also think it's important to keep in mind that these kinds of regulations, they're geared towards human survivability, not necessarily the preservation of the environment. And all these come with their own trade-offs, such as higher costs and disruptions during construction. Communities must confront whether they're ready to accept these inconveniences today for a more secure tomorrow. Meanwhile, planners, they're grappling with even tougher questions about where we should be building at all. Development in high-risk zones continues because people love living close to nature, but each new house adds to the complexity of keeping everyone safe. Again, personal decisions and how they impact the broader community. This house survived, and my hope is that it fuels broader debates about the discussions that we need to be having. How do we balance human desires for cohesive historical aesthetics, community, tradition, and safety? I mean, there's plenty of proof that points at what the issues are and that our latest tools, they work.
The fiber cement cladding that we have all around the house, it's fiber cement made with recycled newsprint and a cement binder. It's extremely fire resistant, which has now been proven out for us.
But one thing is for certain, the next wildfire is on its way, and we need to question how dedicated we are to keeping everyone safe. Which means studying the drawings of our buildings and our neighborhoods. Back in those days, they would have been made as blueprints, the first technology that allowed architects to copy their drawings. That process is utterly fascinating. In my next video, I actually make a blueprint from scratch and explore how blueprinting changed the way that buildings look. You can watch that video right now, because for this entire year, I'm offering exclusive access to all my videos 3 weeks early. They're viewable ad-free on Nebula. If you only watch on YouTube, you're missing out on a lot of content that we make on this channel, like exclusive interviews and a behind-the-scenes tour of our new studio space here. Nebula is a streaming service that's operated and owned by the over 200 creators that are on it. We've pooled our resources together in order to push each other to create even better, more ambitious projects while building one of the most innovative streaming platforms out there. You probably already watch a good amount of the creators that are on there. We're talking about Hoog and City Nerd and Real Engineering, but it's also just a great way to discover new passions. Some of the best stuff comes from our original productions, where bigger budgets let us experiment with brand new ideas. For example, check out Neo's Underexposure. It's some of the most compelling documentary storytelling out there right now. Nebula offers flexible subscription plans too, monthly, annual, and yes, even a lifetime option. That means you can pay only once and have access to everything that Nebula ever creates forever. So start by catching that fascinating look into blueprints and supporting us by clicking on the link on the screen or in the description, or just scan the QR code. You'll save 40% off your Nebula subscription with my link and never miss a video again. It only costs $3 a month when you sign up for a year. Plus, you'll be right at the heart of the media movement that's changing how creators and audiences connect. Check it out, and as always, thanks so much for watching.